Welcome to week four. I'm very pleased with the way the course is going well right now, as you can tell, and as Lauren suggested, I had to travel to New York this week, so I'm posting this video late. But I did want to follow up on some topics that came up in week three, and then also introduce week four. With regard to the discussions are going very, very well. Group one is doing fantastic. I think they had 27 posts last week. So a lot of back and forth, and the other groups are going back and forth quite well as well. But here are some topics, here are some questions that came up, which really apply to the course in general. Here are some topics that came up in terms of from the discussion. One of them, of course, is Solomonic authorship, and whether or not Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. What does that mean if he didn't? And I think the readings and the material that you've come across so far point strongly in favor of non-Solomonic authorship, that the book was simply written too late for Solomon to have been the author or even associated with the book, other than kind of this implicit attribution that we get from reading the details of Kohelet's life. Now, I do want to talk briefly about authorship and traditions of authorship. And I want to kind of focus this. You've read obviously a lot on traditions of Solomon. I want to kind of maybe take a step back and look at even a different character and authorial attribution, and it might help to clarify things. Attribution of authorship often grows over time. And authorship is really a complex thing. I mean, even today we have very complex traditions of authorship. So a person can be cited as the author of the book when actually the book was ghostwritten, and yet the person who the book is attributed to gets the credit for writing the book. Or often people even use pseudonyms today. In fact, Stephen King, early in his career, wrote under the pseudonym Richard Bauckham. And many authors use pseudonyms for various reasons. But let's take a look at David, and particularly the Psalms. Now, in our Hebrew canon, there's 150 Psalms. In the Greek canon, there's actually 151. 116 of the Hebrew Psalms have superscriptions, meaning these tiny titles at the beginning, Le David, Le Shalomo, of Ethan the Ezraite, of Asaph, of the sons of Korah. However, in the Septuagint, 133 Psalms have superscriptions, meaning that somewhere between the kind of development of the Masoretic text, and even this was ongoing, that there was a difference in, there was a growth that happened in the Septuagintal tradition, the Greek tradition, in providing superscriptions for even more psalms than in the Hebrew manuscripts. And so these traditions of authorship, these superscriptions, actually increased over time. Now, there are 13 quote-unquote historical superscriptions in the Psalms. Many of them cited or provide some type of historical information about how the psalm was developed, or what incident in the life of David the psalm applied to. Now, even the translation of, let's say, Le David, which is often translated of David, is not a very easy translation. The lamed, the preposition lamed, can mean to, of, by, for, on behalf of, belonging to. And so even the superscription Le David doesn't mean by David, could mean for David. And even this term David could be used to apply to any of the Davidic kings throughout the Davidic monarchy. And so the Psalms that are written for David could have been written for any of the Davidic kings, Hezekiah, Josiah, any of those individuals. And so anyway, we have this tradition of Davidic authorship. Now, where did this come from? Now, we often reference David as the sweet psalmist of Israel. And we do have some tradition of David being a very skilled musician. In 1 Samuel 16, David plays the lyre for Saul. In 2 Samuel 1, he sings a lament for Saul and Jonathan. In 2 Samuel 3, he sings a lament for Abner. He dances and sings in celebration of the ark. He sings a song after being delivered in 2 Samuel 22, which is basically Psalm 18. and even David's last words are a psalm. However, what's interesting to note is never in the biblical text is David ever mentioned as writing anything. In fact, during David's time, writing would have been very, very rare. Very few people, only trained scribes, would have been literate. And David is not depicted in the biblical text as necessarily a literate person. He was a shepherd growing up and became, basically a warrior, a leader of these bandits, and then ultimately became king of what we kind of in some ways consider this united kingdom. But so there's a tradition that grows. And in fact, the tradition of David being the sweet psalmist of Israel is actually the result of a textual corruption in the Hebrew. 2 Samuel 23:1 is often translated traditionally as calling David the sweet psalmist of Israel. But really, if you were to try to translate it the best you could, it likely translates to something like the lovely one of the songs of Israel, and you can reference the Septuagint's translation there as well. But the Hebrew Zimrot can actually be derived from two different roots. One, zamar, means to sing, and another root, zamar, spelled exactly the same way, means to protect. And actually, when you look at the parallelism and understand the root, the word there, zamar, is coming from the second root, meaning to protect, we get a nice parallelism in that verse. And so it would be translated, the anointed one of the God of Jacob, the anointed one of the God of Jacob, the favorite of the Zimerot Yisrael. So the anointed one parallels the favorite one, meaning David, of the God of Jacob, which parallels the Zimerot Yisrael, the protector of Israel. So really what that 2 Samuel 23:1 should be translated as is the anointed of the God of Jacob, the favorite of the protector of Israel. That makes much more sense than the textual corruption. The version that we have today, that your English translations usually go with, was a sweet psalmist of Israel, which is actually the result of a textual corruption. In any case, traditions of authorship grow over time. David is credited with musical instruments in Nehemiah 12:36, 1 Chronicles 23:5, 2 Chronicles 29:26 through 27. David he's credited in 1 Chronicles 15, 16, and 23 with instituting the musical system of the temple cult. So it's very, very likely that David could have composed psalms. Nobody's saying that he didn't or couldn't. But this tradition of David's authorship grew over time. In a psalm scroll from Qumran in Cave 11, we find this. And David, the son of Jesse, wrote 3,600 psalms, and all the songs which he recited were 446, and songs for making music over the stricken 4, and the total was 4,050. The rabbinic view, David wrote the book of Psalms through 10 elders, through Adam, Melchizedek, Abraham, Moses, Haman, Jeduthun, Asaph, and the 3 sons of Korah. So even the rabbinic view of authorship is very, very complex. In any case, it's not as kind of direct. It's not as simple as just saying David wrote the Psalms. In fact, there's difficulties with just translating Le David, or who David relates to, or dating the Psalms. But and then even identifying anything in the biblical text that would say that David wrote anything, not that composition and writing something are necessarily the same. But there's a tradition that grew, and same thing with Solomon. There's a tradition of Solomonic authorship of these books and attribution to Solomon of these books that grew over time. One thing that was also brought up was, and I'll summarize it this way, the kind of human and divine background, or the human and divine aspect of the biblical text. Here we have the idea that the text is some way inspired by God, but it's also a product of human creativity. And what I would propose is maybe a more broad understanding of inspiration. And I think people often speak of inspiration, but don't necessarily define it very well. And I would say even in the biblical text, we can find multiple models of inspiration. There's the prophetic model, in which a prophet receives an oracle directly from God in whatever way that happens, and then writes that down. We find this very clearly with prophets like Jeremiah or Isaiah or whoever. Or maybe if a prophet even receives a vision and then writes that down. Or there were even forms of divination in ancient Israel, which communicated God's word to, let's say, David, who consulted various forms of divination, or Solomon, or Saul. There's also the kind of, let's say, historian's model of inspiration, where the author looks for God's movement in history and writes historical accounts with the question, how was God involved in this? There would be the kind of psalmist's model of inspiration, in which these psalms, we have to kind of concede the fact that these psalms are very, very human texts, especially laments, which often are proclaiming that Yahweh has not done what he has said he was supposed to do. He's not protected. He's not provided. He's not consoled. He's not defended the psalmist. And so we have to give the psalms their human element and their human credibility. And so here God stands outside of the individual. He's almost a muse that the psalmist is writing to. God's character and the fact that the psalmist believes that he will answer is what inspires the psalmist to reach out to God through song. We could say that we have the sage's model of inspiration, in which God orders the universe in such a way that there's almost a natural theology to it, that one can look at the universe and understand how God wants things to be. It's a very empirical model of inspiration, if you will. And so that doesn't even exhaust the different models of inspiration that one can find in the biblical text. And so I think we maybe need to broaden our understanding of what it means for a text to be inspired. It doesn't necessarily or even mean that God, infused the words into the author, and that's how they came onto the page. Another issue that came up was authorship and authority. And again, I think that we would also have to define what we mean by authority, and even define what we mean by authorship. Do we mean an individual sitting down and writing a text completely, which certainly did happen in the ancient Near East, but there were also communal authorship. There were traditions of authorship, meaning that an individual could be accredited with being an author or being the source of the material, but he himself did not write it. In fact, many of the prophets may not have been literate. However, their scribes, their followers, their disciples may have been literate and collected oracles over time, and then edited these together, compiled these for later communities. And so I think we need to really broaden our idea of authorship, and even even define what we mean by authority. Anyway, so one big significant point that came up in the discussions was the idea of genre identification, and this is critical. In fact, this is something that we have to do on a daily basis in order to properly understand and engage with something we read or watch. In fact, it makes it more difficult now, but if you open a newspaper, you have editorials, you have letters to the editor, you have op-eds, you have journalistic pieces, you have obituaries, you have comics, you have all those things. And so it's important to be able to interpret a text correctly and to engage it. We need to know what genre that text is, and the same thing with biblical texts. And so keep that in mind as we continue to read through the book of Ecclesiastes. Not just the genre of Ecclesiastes specifically, but also the genre of each text that we're looking at. Now let me introduce week 4 very, very briefly. We're going to focus on Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which begins with a poem about time, moves on to topics like toil and injustice and fate. And I want you to put that into dialogue with some Second Temple and Egyptian literature. So you're going to look at a section from the book of Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, And then you're also going to look at a late pseudepigraphic text, another pseudepigraphic text called the Wisdom of Solomon, which is a Hellenistic text written in Greek, definitely not written by Solomon. But I want you to look at similarities and differences in form and content. How are the sayings formed? Do we find those kind of sayings in the book of Ecclesiastes? And then in terms of content, how is wisdom depicted? How is toil depicted? How is fate depicted? And so look for some of those as well. You're also going to do some secondary readings, which are post-colonial readings of Ecclesiastes. We all read the text through a particular lens, which is developed and informed by our experiences and our socioeconomic position in life, our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, etc. And we each respond and are impacted by the text differently based on where we're at. And even a poem as seemingly simple as Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 9, can be read in different ways based on one's socioeconomic position. And this is obviously, I think, is common knowledge for you. But I want you to attend to the very, very fine details and the perspectives that each of these authors present as they read the poem about time. And I want you to interact with them mentally in terms of how you saw the text, and let the text challenge the way you read this poem. You'll also have a video on Ecclesiastes and intertextuality, and I want you to begin after this week bringing in intertextual comments and observations into your exegetical notebook, and you'll find out what I mean in terms of intertextuality if you don't know already when you watch the video. Now I do want to hit up just very, very briefly some issues with the translation from last week. So you translated Ecclesiastes 1, 12 through 18, and chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. You encountered some very repetitive features like the term levi, my heart. And so when Kohelet says, and I spoke with my heart, is that a statement of self-reflection, or is the heart in some way personified? And I think you've encountered both kind of perspectives in the commentaries you've interacted with. But very, very important thing. When you come across the term lemor, often translated to say or saying, there's actually no need to translate it. It's a marker of direct speech. It's very much like us using quotation marks in our writings. And so there's no need to actually translate that. The issue of knowledge and knowing comes up, da'at and yada. Very, very empirical in the way that Kohelet speaks about wisdom and about life. Much more empirical than proverbial wisdom. A proverb seems empirical. That'll say something like, consider the ant. But it's very unlikely that the psalmist kind of went down and looked at the ant empirically and derived this kind of wisdom saying. These wisdom sayings just kind of come out through just common interactions in daily life. But it does seem that Kohelet is very deliberately observing things in life and drawing conclusions from them. It's a very, very empirical thing. Now, one important issue is the term pardes in chapter 2, verse 5. Now, this term, pardes, only occurs 3 times in the Hebrew Bible, in Song of Songs 4:13, and Kohelet 2:5, and Nehemiah 2:8. This is a Persian loanword. And loan words are, they're common today. The term taco or burrito is a loan word from Spanish into English. And we find, again, loan words all over the place. But loan words can be clear signs they can aid in linguistic dating. If we know when those languages began to interact and when a particular loan word entered the language. But the word pardes is a clear sign of the lateness of the composition of the book of Ecclesiastes. In fact, there is no evidence at all of any Persian linguistic influence in Hebrew or any of the Canaanite dialects prior to the Persian period. So after the Cyrus's conquest of Babylon and Babylonia. So it's very clear that for Persian loanwords to have entered the Hebrew language, particularly to be used in a text like Ecclesiastes, we are most likely in the Persian period or later. There's very, very little possibility that these words would have entered the book into the linguistic database, the lexicon of Hebrew speakers or Aramaic speakers prior to the Persian period. Anyway, I look forward to the comments and suggestions this week. Thank you for your continued engagement. Have a great week. Bye.